So in the last section we're going to be doing this semester, we're going to be looking at two different art exhibitions one happened very recently, one back in the 1990s, and have a discussion about art and ethics. So thinking about what responsibility you have as a viewer when you go to see controversial works, to try to see it from the point of view of the artist rather than maybe coming at it specifically from your personal ethical code. And the other thing is, what is the responsibility of museums to protect and exhibit works that may be controversial to a segment of the population? So I'm going to offer you two different exhibitions that both had some controversy to them, and you can choose one to write about, and I'll get back to that, the requirements for writing, in a little bit. First, I'm going to talk about Balthus. Born Balthazar Klosowski, he was a Polish and French man. The works we're going to be looking at were painted in a period from 1939 to 1959. So that's one thing that's important to think about, is to try to put this in the context of the time in which they were made. So here's Balthus at a younger age. One thing to keep in mind too is that we have to consider how cultural sensibilities have changed since these paintings were made. Remember, these were made starting before World War II, and he actually lived until 2001 and painted his whole adult life. But the works you're going to see here were painted in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And if you remember back in the section on the body, a term that came up that's important is this idea of the male gaze, Gaze. This idea that much of nude paintings in art history were made for the pleasure of men, showing them images of women, and of course objectifying the women in those images for men's pleasure. This term, the male gaze, actually wasn't even coined until 1975. So, and again, sensibilities in our culture would have changed over time, particularly after the counterculture movement of the 60s and 70s, that sensibilities about images like this would start to change. Give these paintings a little bit of context before I get into the issues. You'll notice in Balthus's paintings, the main character is a teenage girl and in various states of undress. And these would have been daughters of people that he knew. In some cases, it was the daughter of a servant that worked for him. So Balthus must have been a fairly well-to-do person if he could afford to have servants. And so that's an interesting wrinkle in this story, because if he is the employer of the parents of one of these girls, then he has a certain power over them. And would they decline to let him paint their daughter in fear that they might lose their job? Art historians talk about Balthus's paintings as being words that are used like mystical, that he's exploring these contradictions at a particular period in a person's development, namely puberty, and that there's this shift from youth to knowingness, from modesty to vanity, from innocence to experience. One of the other important questions then to ask is he legitimately exploring these subjects, or is he presenting us a view of these subjects that allows us to be in awe of them at a time when they're still not very self-aware, they're on the verge of but are not really sexual, or is it just plain voyeurism? The exhibition that you're going to be reading about of Balthus's work was an exhibition that took place at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and it was just last year. And here's an article from the New York Times talking about a controversy that came up over one of these images, where a couple of sisters that you see pictured here started a petition to have one of the images in that exhibition removed because they felt that it was inappropriate. This image called Teresa Dreaming. And again, is important to consider about how our cultural sensibilities have changed towards a work like this since it was made. Another thing that is also important and that comes up in this article is the fact that we as a culture have had a pretty serious discussion in recent years about how women are treated in our culture, namely the Me Too movement, in which a number of very high-profile and creative men have really kind of been deposed from their positions. People like Harvey Weinstein, who's a extremely powerful West Coast movie producer, the comedian Louis C.K., the actor Kevin Spacey, no longer on the series House of Cards, former Senator Al Franken. All these men, lost their reputations and their positions because of accusations of sexual misconduct. And so, this exhibition comes at a time when we're already having pretty excruciating conversation about, how women are perceived and treated in our culture. So I think for some, that irony was a little too much. So here are the instructions for this assignment. You can find them in the content area along with the link to this reading. It's a chapter from a textbook, not our normal textbook, but another textbook, and also these two articles that are linked here, but are also linked in the content area. It's important for me to emphasize here that, as it says in bold letters right there, that I'm not interested in your personal opinion about this. This is not an op-ed piece. What you are supposed to do is to inform yourself with the readings and defend a position about one of these two exhibitions. I'll show you the next one in a minute. You can form that position by answering these questions, but put it in a coherent narrative form and tell me if you think that the exhibition was good the way it was, should have been changed, should it have been closed. The next exhibition I'm going to show you was an exhibition of works by Robert Mapplethorpe that took place in 1990, and it became a very controversial exhibition on both sides of the issue. People who defended it and those who thought that it was obscene and should be closed. I actually attended this exhibition. A friend of mine and I drove. I lived in the Pittsburgh area at the time. This was Cincinnati, which is about a 4-hour drive, and so I saw it firsthand. To tell the story very quickly, this was an exhibition of work by Robert Mapplethorpe. This is a self-portrait of him kind of as a rocker. This was an exhibition that made its way around the country after his death. He died of AIDS in 1989, and so this was a retrospective exhibition. It was a very large exhibition, and I'll show you some of the more controversial works here in a minute. One thing I'll just say as a kind of disclaimer, you are of course welcome to look up more of his works online. I'm going to show you some of the tamer versions of his homoerotic work. I actually cleared doing this assignment with both my department chair and with the dean of the College of Arts and Humanities. This exhibition really took a look at how Robert Mapplethorpe evolved as an artist, and changed over time, and ultimately that he created what he called this XYZ portfolio, and I'll show you what I mean by that. He did a number of self-portraits during his career, and of course was a gay man, so he was kind of looking at himself in different ways. Sadly, this is what Robert Mapplethorpe looked like in the last year of his life. One thing, if you're not really familiar with it, AIDS is something that comes with its own political baggage. When AIDS was first discovered, New York City, where Robert Mapplethorpe lived and worked, was really the epicenter of gay culture in this country. This is long before we had the alphabets of LGBTQ. Being gay was much more of a stigma in our culture. So anybody that wanted to be openly gay really had to live in a cultural center like New York. And when that epidemic started, some pretty staggering numbers that between 1981 and 1992, almost 38,000 AIDS-related deaths just in New York City. That's several thousand deaths a year, every year, and nobody understood the mechanics of AIDS early on, so there was no treatment for it. So virtually anybody that got it died. And so, really Robert Mapplethorpe was just, in a sense, documenting the world that he lived in as a gay man, from a more visually sophisticated point of view than the average person. And these are some of the works that were in that exhibition. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is this idea of the XYZ portfolio. What you're seeing here would be part of the X portion. These were sometimes very graphic images of overtly sexual, sometimes sadomasochistic images, and of course the ones that drew the most controversy. The Y portion of that portfolio was actually images that he made of women, Y being the yoni principle, the sort of female archetypal principle. So he photographed women in his career as well. Even though he was a gay man, he admired, I think, a female sensibility of powerful females. And part of that Y portfolio included images of flowers that he went back to over and over again. So very formal studies. And then the third part of the XYZ portfolio, the Z, was photographs that he made of African American men, nude studies. And Z is symbolic of death. This was the epicenter of the AIDS epidemic, and so in making these images of gay men, he's acknowledging that, of course, they were all subject to being victims of AIDS. My last slide on here shows you how the XYZ portfolio was exhibited in that exhibition. And I saw this exhibition. It was in a room by itself. You had to get in a long line to see it because it was laid virtually flat. This was done deliberately so that if someone who did not want to see it, if a minor was in the museum, that they couldn't look into the room and see it accidentally. You had to very deliberately come into this room in this line to see this work. And it really is something that I think is highly overlooked, that of course everybody latched onto the X part, this row right here, the sexually explicit images. But what Robert Mapplethorpe was doing was creating a really interesting and thoughtful kind of grid of works where you have a line of X images, you had a line of Y images, and you had a line of Z images. But there was also a relation between these images in the vertical too. So this row all had something in common. This row all had something in common. This row all had something in common. So it was a really unique and thoughtful work that he likely put together in the last years of his life, kind of summing up the work that he did. And so again, it's your job in this assignment to understand the issues of what happened back then and create an informed opinion about it. This exhibition was actually shut down by the police, and the curator was put on trial for obscenity. He was acquitted, and so I think that was a very touchy moment in our history of whether museum curators could be tried as criminals for doing their job of showing works that are sometimes controversial, that it's part of the job of the curator to protect and exhibit works that some people might find offensive. So your job is to pick either the Mapplethorpe exhibition or the Balthus exhibition. Use these instructions and write an essay of 500 to 800 words stating your position on one of these exhibitions. So, of course, if you have any questions, just email me.